16 there, he said that Daniel desired, or rather, he desired that he would have time to make that interpretation of the dream. But in verses 17 and 18, it says, Then Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they would desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So you see there in verse 18, it seems as if they're making the request that they would be able to do that so that they would not perish like those astrologers and soothsayers of the king would do. But there in verses 17 and 18 again, we find that they went and had prayer together. Then we come to verses 19 through 23. And I want us to spend some time looking at verses 19 through 23. And one of the things in this, Daniel is going to make this revelation. God revealed a secret to Daniel. Daniel blessed God. And there's some things in these verses I want us to look at. What does Daniel teach us? What do we learn? What are lessons that we can draw from this particular section, verses 19 through 23? Notice what he says there in those verses. Verse number 19. Then was a secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers. Thou hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what he desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Going now to verse 23, there's several things in that that Daniel speaks about, and he speaks about things concerning God. So we can learn some lessons in this of Daniel speaking about God. There in verse number 20, he speaks there about wisdom and might are God's, are his. Wisdom and might are his. In Proverbs chapter 2 and verse number 6. Notice there in that passage. Now when it says there that wisdom and knowledge are his, I take that to mean he is the source of wisdom and knowledge. It is by and through God that we have proper knowledge. And there in that verse, Proverbs chapter 2 and verse number 6, it says, For the Lord giveth wisdom, out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. The Lord giveth wisdom. And then in Ephesians chapter 3 verse 10, look at that passage. Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10. Where it says, To the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. And if you look at that word manifold means multifaceted. It's really beyond our comprehension of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How we can't even begin to think or understand about one that knows everything, that nothing gets by without him knowing it. That's something we just cannot fathom. Here he knows what we're doing here this evening. He knows what's going on in Germany and Italy, all the places around the world. God knows exactly what's going on with every person, not just a group of people, with everybody. God knows and God understands. Again, there, the manifold wisdom of God. But also in verse 21, if you look back there to verse 21, it says there, He changes the times and the seasons. He removed the kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. Now, in the context of this, he's talking about a dream that he's had, that the king had. And Daniel is going to be able to interpret that dream. Tell him what the dream was, and then tell him what it meant. Well, what's the context of it? Well, he's talking about those kingdoms that would be set up. The multiple kingdoms that would be coming along. And of course, in verse 44, he speaks there about this kingdom that's going to last forever. And speaking about, of course, the church. So when he talks here about the times and the seasons, again there we have to understand the reference is to what the vision or the dream was. Now, God controls all the seasons. But I believe what he's talking about here is the fact that God is the one who chooses the times and the seasons that these events are going to take place. God is going to be the one who determines when the king comes in and when the other king goes out. God is in control of that because ultimately it's going to come down to that eternal kingdom that we know of course, as the church. In Daniel chapter 4 and verse number 17, there it says, The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever he will, and setteth up over it the basis of men. So the point there is that God is the one who is putting these things into place. For instance, when we think about Jeremiah's prophecy and Isaiah's prophecies concerning a king, what is stated years ahead of time? That Cyrus is going to come to the throne. Who's going to put him on that throne? Well, God is going to be the one who deals with those things. He puts things in place as he sees fit. Look at Jeremiah chapter 27. Jeremiah 27, beginning in verse number 5. And we'll read down through verse 10. Jeremiah 27, beginning in verse number 5. It says, I have made the earth, the man and the beast that are upon the ground, by my great power and by my outstretched arm, and have given it unto whom it seemeth meet unto me. In other words, saying God is giving it as he sees fit. Then it goes on and says, and now have I given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field have I given him also to serve him. And all nations shall serve him, and his son, and his son's son, until the very time of his land which come. And then many nations and great kings shall serve themselves of him. And it shall come to pass that the nation and the kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, and that will not put his neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation shall I punish, saith the Lord, with the sword and with the famine and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. Therefore hearken not ye to your prophets, nor to your diviners, nor to your dreamers, or to your enchanters, nor to your sorcerers, which speak unto you, saying, Ye shall not serve the king of Babylon. For they prophesy a lie unto you, to remove you far from your land, and that I should drive you out, and ye should perish. Now what does that sound like? God is putting that in. He's saying even if people come up against Nebuchadnezzar, what's going to happen to them?
He'll own them.
He will. They'll be destroyed. They'll be taken away. And the point there, in my mind, is the fact that this is God's plan, God's eternal plan. You can look at the kings that were put in place. We come down to old Cyrus, and God used Cyrus. When you go, remember we studied in the book of Esther. When you look there at Artaxerxes, a vile, evil person, but he was used in the preservation of the Jewish people by Mordecai and Esther. But the point here, when he speaks about the time, in other words, God is in charge. God knoweth when these things are going to take place, and they're in His eternal purpose. By His providence, these things are going to come about. And even there in Daniel chapter 4:17, where it says, "The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men." What does that sound like? The Most High is God. What happens? He rules in the kingdom of men. And we look at our world today, and we look at what's going on in the kingdoms around the world today, and we say, "Oh my, what a terrible thing," and it is. But what's going to happen one of these days? God's going to say it's over, and it'll be over. And sometimes those kings were used. That captivity was used to do what? To bring Israel into control, so they would repent and come out and not go into idolatry anymore. So back to this, there in that verse in Daniel 4:17, "The Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomever He will." And then he says there, "and setteth up over it the basest of men." What is that? What does the word basest mean? Low, bad. And they have a purpose. They serve a purpose. And sometimes we don't see that, we don't understand it, but God's going to put things in the manner that He wants them to be in. In verse 21, again it says, "He gives wisdom to the wise." Well, look at James chapter 1. In James chapter 1 and verse number 5. We're talking about He gives wisdom to the wise. And you'd stop and you'd say, well, why would He give wisdom to those people who are already wise? Well, He's talking there about He gives wisdom to those who deserve that wisdom. And in James chapter 1 verse 5, it gives an insight into that. It says, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him." Asking for wisdom. And we talked about wisdom before. Wisdom is taking knowledge and using it properly. Also in Proverbs 2, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Therefore the Lord giveth wisdom, out of His mouth cometh knowledge and understanding. He layeth up sound wisdom for the righteous. He is a buckler of them that walk uprightly." So there's the idea again of God giving wisdom to those who ask for and who desire and deserve to have that wisdom. Then it's still in verse 21 of Daniel chapter 2. He gives knowledge to those that have understanding. In Proverbs chapter 1, in verse 7. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Of course, that's pretty self-explanatory, isn't it? When you begin to think about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You know, when we want to know, we're going to be able to find it. Is it hot in here?
Oh, yeah.
Not so bad up here. Let them both go. This weekend we'll have to go back to the heat. Yeah. Okay, back to verse 21. He gives knowledge to those who have understanding. And we talked there about Proverbs 1, verse 7. Also, in Exodus chapter 31. Look there at verse 3 of Exodus 31. Here he's talking about individuals that God has given certain abilities to. Now, in this it says, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship. Here God had a purpose. And I forget those fellows' names. There's two that are mentioned there in that. But the point is, God chooses, or at that point in time in the history of man, He chose people for certain things to do. And here was these who were chosen. It's kind of interesting there at the end. He says, in all manner of workmanship. There were things that needed to be done, things that had to be taken care of. And so God made those choices. Look at verse number 22 of Daniel chapter 2. Verse 22 says, He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. He reveals the deep and secret things. Now we've been talking about His knowledge, His wisdom, being the possessor of all knowledge and all wisdom. And in that verse, it speaks about Him knowing the deep and secret things. In Psalm 44, in verse 21, it says, Shall not God search this out, for He knoweth the secrets of the heart. In other words, they're saying God can look and see and know all about us, about our hearts, our thoughts. And that, to me, I don't know about you, but that's a scary thing. Just to think about God knows every aspect of my life. Every thought, every word, every action, God knows it. And when He talks about the deep and secret things, I wonder how many people there are today that think they can do things and hide from God. People are doing it all the time. That's why so much of things are done in the night. Nobody else knows. But yes, there is someone that knows. God knows every. And the thought, just the thought that we have. You ever been driving down 35 and poof, you have to say, forgive me, Lord. Because our thoughts are there. And it's to me that's a barrier. It's a boundary that holds us, knowing that God knows everything, every thought, every action. You know, I've said this before. Most of us, growing up, you know, when our mamas and daddies were around, we were pretty good. But then when we got away from that, we felt like those boundaries were not there. But see, you can't get away from God. I could get away from mom and daddy, but I can't get away from God. The deep and secret things. I can hide nothing from God. And, when I think I have, when Judgment Day comes, what will be revealed? The secret things, the things of the heart. Everything's going to be laid bare. And so therefore, when he speaks here about how he reveals the deep and secret things, verse 22 there again says he knows what is in the darkness. And the idea there is things, as I said, we try to get away from him, but it also has to do with the idea of things that are not here yet, things that are yet to come. When he talks about these kings, God knew exactly what was going to take place. What did he do? What did God do about Israel when they got out there in the promised land and had been there a while? And one of the things they decided they wanted was to have a king. Remember? Wanted to have a king. Well, what had God already done prior to them talking about wanting a king? God had already put rules in place for a king. This king had certain parameters. He had certain qualifications, certain things. And they hadn't brought that up. God knows those things that are not yet here, not yet come. And so, with this, again, talking about these people, Israel and the kings that would be coming to the throne, and how they would affect God's people. He knows the things that are in the darkness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse number 5, it says there, therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will make manifest the counsels of the heart, and then shall every man have praise of God. Things that were not yet there, as we said. We gave that illustration about having kings. Also, we talked a moment ago and gave the illustration about Cyrus. God through the prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, not only did he say that Cyrus would come to the throne and he would let the people. How long were they going to be in captivity? 70 years. God had already told them you'll be there 70 years through the prophets. So, when you look back and think about what Daniel is saying here about God, he's laying out the greatness, the power, the majesty of Almighty God. Again, in verse number 22, it tells us that light dwells with him. What does that make you think of when it says there in verse number 22 that light dwells with him? What does light represent? Goodness. Darkness represents badness. Is that a good word? Things that are bad. In 1 John chapter 1, it talks there about light and darkness, doesn't it? God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. None. So, when we look and understand that light dwells with him, another passage that comes to mind is John chapter 1, when it speaks there about the light came into the world, and the world comprehended it not. He's the light of men, and he is, when it speaks about the light, it refers to a lot of things. Life, a direction. I don't know if you ever picture this in your mind, but I never, ever go to Matthew 7:13 and 14 that I don't think about light and dark. Because that broad way has no lights on it. It's dark. The narrow way is fully lit because God is there. And those who are walking in the light are there. So in this section, you find that God has revealed these things through and by this man Daniel. A lot of things could be said when you look at Daniel. And as we get further into the book, we're going to see more and more and more about him. And we're going to see more and more about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because here is examples of those who were faithful in difficult circumstances. You know, I said this Sunday morning in our lesson. You know, we live in a time, what restraints do we have? I mean, really, I'm talking about what spiritual restraints do we have?
None other than those words.
We have from God, we have His Word. But as far as the world around us, now they're trying with all of their might to do things that would put restraints. But what would we do if we were told, you can't do this, you can't do that? And it hadn't been too long ago that I had someone say, well, what are you going to do when the government tells you you cannot speak against homosexuality? What are you going to do when they make it illegal to do that? My answer, that'll be my first sermon. My first sermon. I can say that with vim and vigor. But we might be tested someday. And then what will we do? I used the example Sunday morning about people who forsake the assembling of the saints. What if somebody said, you can't assemble anymore? Well, they'd be happy, wouldn't they? I don't have to go today, not even one time. But Daniel, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they remain faithful. Faithful in a difficult situation. Not just somebody saying you cannot, but here's what's going to happen to you if you do worship God. You're going to be thrown in the lion's den. You're going to be thrown in a burning fiery furnace. Somebody asked me one time, which would you rather have done to you? My answer is neither. But if I had to make a choice, I'd rather have to fight lions than try to fight a burning furnace. So the point we're looking at this is the fact that with Daniel, with these people, we're going to see that they maintain their faithfulness to God. Now, when we come on over into verses 24 and 25, Daniel comes and he requests an audience with the king, and he has that interpretation. Verses 26 through 28, Daniel tells the king that the wise men, astrologers, magicians, soothsayers cannot reveal this thing to the king, but there is a God in heaven that can. You know, you look at the statements there involved in that when he makes that. He does not say, I can, but he gives to God. Verse 27 says, Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, soothsayers show unto the king. Now watch what he says. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Now, again, I want you to notice, he says, these people, your people, are not able to do this. But, there is a God, the God of heaven, that can. Now, before we go too much further into that direction, there are times, as we're going to see in a little bit, that Nebuchadnezzar is even going to recognize the God of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if we're not careful when we read those things, we have the first impression that Nebuchadnezzar accepts the God of heaven. But what Nebuchadnezzar does is he puts the God of heaven on the same shelf with all of his gods. He recognizes that Daniel has a God that's powerful. But he's not, even in this chapter, he's going to recognize the fact. But then, a little bit later, he's going to put up a golden image. And then he's going to punish those who won't bow down to that image. So the reason I wanted to say that is because if we're not careful, we have the tendency to say, well, Nebuchadnezzar, he accepted the God of heaven as one of. Remember when Paul went into Athens and he saw all those gods and he said, let me tell you about the unknown God. But they had gods for everything. And Nebuchadnezzar is going to recognize that Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that Israel had a God, and this God had power. But he's going to put him up there on the same shelf with those other gods. So, in verses 29 through 35, Daniel reveals the dream. And he talks about how the dream will come later. Verse 29. It says, as for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth the secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me as any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. Now, the point he's saying here is, we're going to talk about what God has spoken. Larry, you might want to ring the bell. Or Bodie, you back there. So in this, Daniel is going to reveal the fact that these things are going to take place. And it's going to be drawn out over a long period of time. From Nebuchadnezzar all the way down to the last king that is in control over these people. And as we're going to see here in just a little bit, when he talks about that dream, he's going to talk about those kingdoms, the various kingdoms that's going to be set up. And then ultimately, there is that final kingdom. And that kingdom is an eternal kingdom. The others are going to fall. The others are going to be overthrown. You know, that was one of the things about a king back in who would want to be a king in that day and time? You had to be worried about your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters, everybody that came around. Yes.
Well, in the 400 years after, the silent years, we know that that's what the Hebrew people did to themselves. They might not have worshipped idolaters, they might not have been idolaters, but they definitely off all their families so that they could be the leader of the land. I mean, they killed them. Was it Hasmonean?
Well,
Hasmonean family?
Yeah, these kings, their lifespan sometime. Well, what was Nehemiah's work?
Taster, right? Food taster.
Yeah, he was a cupbearer.
Yeah.
He was making sure the king didn't get poisoned. There were always those things around. So, and there was kings that would come in and overthrow. Some would not be on the throne, but just a short period of time. And that, that happened even when you got back over into the divided kingdom, especially in the north. But anyway, this dream is revealed that it was going to come to pass. I'm going to go through these, and we'll come back and talk about them more Sunday. But what did the king see? What was the dream? Well, there's a great image whose form was terrible. Verse 31. Its head was of fine gold. Verse 32. Breast and arms were of silver. Verse 32. Its belly and thighs were of brass. Verse 32. Its legs were of iron. Verse 33. Its feet were of iron and clay. Verse 33. And then in verse 34 it speaks about a stone that was cut out without hands. That is, not seen by men. Not cut out with hands, with men. And he smote the image at his feet and broke it into many pieces. Verse 34. And then in verse 35, all of the parts of this great image were blown away, and the stone which struck the image became a great mountain and filled the earth. What a great description of the eternal kingdom. It filled the earth. Most of these kingdoms that we talked about, Babylon, they did not conquer, or they did not fill the whole world. But this one is going to. And it's going to be the only one. Now, there are kingdoms today, but there's only one that is authorized by God. Okay, we'll stop there, and when we come back Sunday, we'll talk about what these things were.